Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Helen Young and I'm with the Feinstein International Center at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. We're thrilled to have so many of you joining us today to discuss the problem of global acute malnutrition and why it persists despite ongoing humanitarian action and other interventions. So, just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We know that the audio can be a little tricky on WebEx. So I just want to show you a graphic so that it's clear to those who can't hear me. On the second menu from the top, you can click on Quick Start. Then please click on Connect using computer in the circle on the left of your screen. Which should get the audio working for you. Anyway, this webinar is scheduled for 1.5 hours and we will end on or before that. So we're very much looking forward to an engaging discussion and we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. We will begin compiling the questions throughout, so I would encourage you to use the chat function to ask questions as they come to mind. Now, for that, you will see on the top right of your screen a blue icon for chat. Click this to open a chat box, and then you can send your questions at any point, and we will try to get 20 to 30 minutes of the webinar. And also, finally, to let everyone know, we are recording the webinar. Now, this webinar is actually part of a project titled Synthesizing Research on Resilience in Dryland and Fragile Contexts. And this is funded by the USAID Center for Resilience. Now, throughout the project, the Feinstein International Center at Tufts has been synthesizing our research from the past decade or more on 3 major themes related to resilience. The first being the persistent problem of global acute malnutrition, or as we often refer to it, GAM for short. The second area is the conflict and resilience nexus. Now this webinar has already been completed, as has the third webinar on the various pathways to resilience, particularly in pastoralist areas. The papers, synthesis papers, briefing papers and webinars are available on each topic. Now this is the final webinar and all the materials will be available on the Feinstein website. And as I mentioned, today we are focused on the problem of persistent GAM or global acute malnutrition. Now, our synthesis report focuses on the problem of persistent global acute malnutrition among children, meaning a threshold of 15% GAM, which signifies a humanitarian emergency. Now, we've found in the context where we've worked in the past, including, for example, Chad, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and South Sudan, we have noticed the persistence of emergency levels of GAM above this threshold in protracted emergencies after the acute phase has ended or even once recovery was underway. And we're finding that agencies are frequently intervening in the same exact places year after year, and in spite of interventions, malnutrition persists. Now, in some contexts, it's been argued that this issue has been normalized, meaning there has been a creeping acceptance of higher levels of malnutrition, an assumption that the situation is not as bad as the prevalence rates might suggest. An alternative view is that this high GAM has been attributed to an artifact of the measurement tools. In other words, it's partly the result of using the weight for height measurement or indicator among populations that have a particular body shape, long legs in relation to their trunk. So clearly, there are a lot of wide-ranging views and opinions. But perhaps the first question we have to ask is just how widespread is this problem of persistent GAM? And what evidence do we have regarding the drivers of GAM in these contexts? The Synthesis Project has given us the opportunity to review the scale of this problem and also to better understand the causal pathways and the methodological challenges for getting to grips with this, as well as the current program and policy challenges and the priorities for future research, all topics covered in our report. Now, just a few words on our approach. We combined a desk study with a total of 25 interviews with experts in this field, including nutritionists and other professionals working for INGOs, UN agencies and donors, as well as independent technical experts and consultants. Now, we incorporated their views and experience throughout the work, which I believe provides us with a unique and important perspective from professionals in this field. And for this reason, I'm especially delighted to be joined today by 4 very senior nutritionists who between them have decades of professional experience working with a wide range of national and international actors, NGOs and donors. So let me introduce our panel. First, we have Josephine Ipe, who is the Global Nutrition Cluster Coordinator for the Office of Emergency Programs at UNICEF in Geneva. Josephine has 25 years of nutrition experience with UNICEF and various NGOs in countries including Uganda, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, Bangladesh, Malawi, Tanzania, DRC, and Nicaragua. Her work has focused around nutrition policy and programming, and also partnership and coordination in the technical areas of public health, nutrition, and food security. Next is Gwenelle Luc. Gwenelle is the Link NCA Technical Advisor at Action contre la Faim in Paris. She is a socio-anthropologist by background with a particular interest in the links between gender and undernutrition and community development in humanitarian action. She has spent 8 years in the field, mainly in the Sahel and Central Africa, conducting applied research in anthropology to improve humanitarian action before moving to her current role with ACF. Grania Maloney is the Chief of the Nutrition Section with UNICEF Kenya. She has 18 years experience in nutrition policy and programming and food and nutrition security assessment and analysis with the UN and NGO sectors. Notably, she was the Chief Technical Advisor of the FAO unit that was responsible for the analysis that led to the declaration of famine in 2011 in Somalia, which she has published widely on. And finally, we have Abigail Perry, who is the Senior Nutrition Advisor at the UK Department for International Development. She has a breadth of nutrition experience developed while working with a range of NGOs and academic institutions over the past 15 years. She's worked for DFID since 2011, and she's currently leading the UK's engagement with the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, No Wasted Lives, and other global initiatives, and she provides technical and policy leadership for DFID's nutrition investments, including relating to malnutrition in humanitarian emergencies and effective management of acute malnutrition. In addition to the panelists, I'm also pleased to be joined by my colleague Anastasia Marshak, who is the co-author of our synthesis paper and is here standing by to contribute to our session and in particular to the Q&A. So let us start by focusing on the scale of the problem. As I mentioned, we found that persistent GAM continues to be an ongoing and alarming problem, despite global improvements in malnutrition and under-5 mortality. Now, this issue is directly relevant to humanitarian action, especially in protracted crises, but also to longer-term recovery and resilience building. But how well informed are we about this problem? And this is where our experienced panel can come in. So I'd like to turn to Grania and ask, in your experience, how widespread is the problem of persistent GAM? And has this issue been given sufficient attention by governments and international agencies? And if not, what should we be doing about it? So over to you, Grania.
Thank you. I think the first challenge we have, and we've probably generated this ourselves to a large part, is the continued perception of GAM as an emergency issue. Whereas fundamentally, now we know that probably over 80% of cases of acute malnutrition are actually in the development context. And as you highlighted in your paper, particularly in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And then the only difference really in emergencies is actually the scale. So we've kind of misinformed the global community by focusing on GAM as an emergency issue, when fundamentally it's a development issue. And this is also the case not just in these countries, but also in countries in the Horn of Africa like Somalia, Ethiopia, and Kenya, where even in a good year, where some, many of the indicators might be better and GAM might drop, but the burden is still very, very high. And the drivers fundamentally are the same. So we cannot resolve it through an emergency response only. And then this perception, unfortunately, directly affects response. So while we're very effective at raising alarm bells when we have high GAM, this 15% that we have put for ourselves, and we can get funding relatively easy, it's much harder when we have lower rates. And yet, for example, when we have lower rates and in dense populations, we end up with many more children that actually need treatment. Again, an example from Kenya, the third highest burden in Kenya is actually Nairobi, and that's even though we have less than 5% acute malnutrition, the population density is very high. And yet, why are these children not, why don't they deserve to be treated as much as a child in the very high burden counties as well, like Turkana? Why are we artificially separating out emergency acute malnutrition and non-emergency acute malnutrition? Because now we know that, in fact, the burden is devastating, not just at an individual level, but also at population level. And new evidence is showing that it's not just, acute malnutrition is not just about an immediate risk to death. So then assuming that once the child is rehabilitated, that they are fine and they'll move on. But now we know that actually it can desperately affect the cognitive development of children as well. And we know that infants under 6 months who are severely malnourished, even if they do recover, they have a much lower chance of actually reaching their first birthday than well-nourished children. So therefore, the prevention and management of acute malnutrition needs to be treated as a development issue, a priority primary healthcare issue, with the level of global and domestic commitment and financing as the other big killers of young children, such as malaria and pneumonia. So then the question is, how do we do that? Well, I think it's interesting to look at the SUN movement, which is a very successful movement, which has shown that even without a funding mechanism tied to it, it really attracted a lot of global attention. A lot of countries signed up to it, they were committed to it, they understood that something was bad. Did we miss an opportunity by not adding acute malnutrition to the advocacy package for SUN, given that a lot of the drivers and prevention strategies are similar? Perhaps. But I think they were also successful because they focused in on key messages around the impact on the individual and national GDPs, made it about finances, and focused in on a specific age cohort. So from the moment of conception to the age of 2. Probably that all helps. So how do we actually do that within the realm of acute malnutrition? Well, the first thing we need to do is to take it out of the emergency realm and now to make it a public health and development priority. And now we have this new initiative, which is great, the No Wasted Lives initiative, which is bringing focus and coherence to the discussion, and which is focusing on ensuring that all children suffering from acute malnutrition have access to treatment by 2030. And that double the proportion of children annually receiving treatment for severe acute malnutrition will be reached by 2020. Now, that target is 6 million by 2020. In 2015, we only reached 2.5 million children. And right now, we're only reaching 20% of those in need. So we have a long way to go. And the only way we can do that is to get it integrated as a core health priority, both in terms of prevention and treatment, and bring it into the community-level dialogue as well. The next focus is domestic financing. Again, acute malnutrition is seen as an emergency issue, so it's the emergency donors, it's the emergency appeals that attract funding for acute malnutrition. But that's not how it should be. How do we make it a national priority along with stunting so it gets domestic financing, so that commodities are available in every single health facility where a child needs it, and so that we have financing models behind it to make it sustainable and feasible for government. How do we bring the cost down of commodities, noting that commodities are a part of the treatment, and noting that we have reduced the prices of commodities significantly in the last 10 years? But can we learn from vertical programs or funding mechanisms like GAM Global Fund that provide subsidized commodities for other time killers? How can we learn from them to do the same for acute malnutrition so that it's treated as a routine intervention and it's across all the countries that have children who are acutely malnourished? And then using if it's scale, when the scale increases, bringing in financing models like our blast appeals, like our emergency appeals, so that then the more traditional emergency donors can tap up government so that they can then actually scale up and meet the additional needs. But really, how do we finance that burden, the majority of children that we see across the year in all of these countries, so that each of them has an equal access to treatment that they deserve? And then what about assessment? We overcomplicate things in our sector. We give confusing and conflicting advice. So how do we as a community make it easier for decision makers to use the data we generate without using clauses such as it's not representative, confidence intervals overlap, or we shouldn't use NEOAC, or we shouldn't use weight for height? And I myself will admit that I am responsible for having used those in the past. But what other indicators can we use to actually know when our numbers are going up and down? What other types of tools are there to then influence financing models so we can reach these children and give them the care that they need? And then finally, prevention. That's the big focus. How do we actually prevent children from becoming malnourished? We don't want them to become malnourished. They actually don't deserve it. It's not good for them, both in short term and long term. And noting that a lot of the prevention strategies is similar to that of stunting. How do we maximize the discussions around stunting and bring it together to make sure that we are giving both levels of nutrition outcomes the same levels of importance, and recognizing that prevention of acute malnutrition is not about a quick fix, not about a commodity, but it's years of investment in the health system and getting it to be treated as a public health priority. So parallel programs looking at prevention at scale, but then treatment at scale. That's important both from a moral and a development perspective. So if I can summarize, I think the 4 key points that I would like to focus is that acute malnutrition should no longer be viewed as an emergency issue. It's not an emergency issue. The only difference in an emergency is the scale. We shouldn't focus any longer on the quick fix, emergency appeals, emergency financing. We know that acute malnutrition also has a devastating impact on children's development long term, so it needs to have long-term solutions to give these children a chance. We need longer-term development solutions and financing models, looking at the lessons from other mechanisms like Gavi and the Global Fund to address it at scale. And then finally, ultimately, prevention really is the key area. Treatment is only for a small number of these children, but how do we actually prevent? And that comes in nicely with the slide that you're just seeing, because we are looking at bringing down the numbers and we are looking at increasing the treatment, but ultimately our objective should be to actually prevent in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grania. Thank you especially for these insights and for highlighting that this is not only a humanitarian issue, but it's also a development issue and needs to be, and the fact it needs to be prioritized also as a domestic issue. That said, I would say that when we were undertaking our review, we were indeed surprised by the large number of countries that our interviewees identified as examples of where persistent GAM has been found. So the fact that this persists across many protracted humanitarian crises does remain a challenge, in addition to the fact that this is also a development issue. Looking at the available survey data, our report presents 4 very particular regional case studies where the prevalence of GAM has remained above 15% over a long period, including specific regions in Chad, Bangladesh, South Sudan, and Niger, among another 20 countries that we identified. We found that it was quite a challenge to identify the medium to long-term GAM trends, in part because of the lack of data. And I'd like to stop for a minute and ask Anna if she can tell us about some of these data constraints.
Thank you, Helen. So I'm going to be briefly talking about some of the challenges related to identifying the scope and scale of persistent GAM. And these mainly apply to comparability over time and comparability across populations. So one of the main constraints has to do with a limitation in historical data on nutrition indicators. If you look at the figure in the PowerPoint, this is a compilation done by some of our colleagues of all of the nutrition surveys that they could find. And you can see a very clear bias towards the most recent 5 years, which really makes it very difficult to establish long-term trends in wasting. Another issue has to do with gaps in the data. So while the SMART methodology is fantastic because it's standardized and allows us to compare these nutrition indicators across time and locations, most SMART surveys are really conducted in emergency periods, which means we have gaps in data availability during stable times, and that again hampers our ability to evaluate wasting and how that changes between emergencies and more stable periods. Another issue has to do with seasonal variation. Unlike stunting, wasting can change drastically throughout the year, sometimes more so than between years, which means we can't just have one data point for wasting for the year unless we compare specifically between that season. But ideally, we'd have multiple points in order to better understand that seasonal variations. And finally, in relation to comparability over time, is the switch from NCHS reference data to WHO growth standards in 2006. The last point has to do about comparability across populations. This can be a challenge considering different sitting height standing ratios, say between Somali pastoralists and Ethiopian highlanders. So really, in order to truly be able to establish any trend in wasting, we need consistent data on a yearly basis capturing seasonal variation on the same geographic area and population over time. While this sounds like a tall order, it's actually not inconsistent with the data demands of measuring nutrition indicators for both the World Health Assembly and the Sustainable Development Goals. Plus, the majority of NGOs that have ongoing programs already collect a large amount of data for the purpose of monitoring and evaluation with a focus on nutrition indicators. So without consideration for long-term comparability, we're really missing an opportunity for a historical understanding of malnutrition. Thanks, and Helen, back to you.
Thanks very much, Anna. So let's now turn to the issues of what is driving these persistently high GAM prevalence rates. The people we interviewed generally agreed that an understanding of the drivers of global acute malnutrition must inform the design of interventions that are intended to prevent acute malnutrition. And in relation to that, we have the UNICEF conceptual framework, which remains the most well-known and widely adopted conceptual framework as the basis for this analysis. However, our interviewees also noted that in a protracted crisis, the drivers of persistent GAM are not generally well understood. And so I wanted to ask our second panelist, Gwenelle Look, do we have a clear idea about the drivers of persistent GAM? And if so, what are they? And if not, why is that?
Thank you, Helen. So there are many reasons why we are still unclear about the drivers of persistent GAM. First, acute malnutrition is multi-causal and context-related. It is likely that all three underlying causes, food, care, and health, potentially all play a role. So there may be no single reason responsible for persistent GAM. While we all use the UNICEF causal framework, all the factors need to be explored. Indeed, there is a tendency to focus only on the underlying drivers of malnutrition rather than on basic causes. For example, insecurity, lack of protection, marginalization, gender inequity, livelihood, or seasonality. We need to look at drivers in 3 dimensions and to focus on pathway and their dynamics as they are interlinked and multisectorial. The first dimension will be the vertical one. We will look at interaction between immediate, underlying, and basic causes. For example, we will look at how women's social status can influence the access to food. And for the second dimension, the horizontal one, we need to look at interaction between underlying risk factors. For example, we will look at how food access will influence care practices. And the third dimension will be about the timing and the dynamics. Here we will look at the seasonal or historical trends for each driver and their impact on GAM. Even though we are still unclear about persistent GAM driver, there is a strong demand from operational actors to have a better understanding on the major pathway leading to undernutrition, in order to be able to design or adjust their intervention. To respond to this field need, ACF has developed the Linkage and Key Methodology to identify the major pathway leading to undernutrition in their 3 dimensions, and to be able to prioritize problems to be addressed. The methodology was originally built up on a compromise between scientific research and RCT to prove causality and operational constraints, which are mainly time and budget. So the Link and Key methodology is multi-sectorial and response-oriented. It uses mixed methods, both qualitative and quantitative, and a participatory approach, involving governmental, scientific, and operational stakeholders, and most of all, communities. So, but we learned by doing that having a good understanding of the main pathway leading to undernutrition is not enough to come up with the right solution. The limit of a good context analysis is that uptake remains difficult for operational actors to tailor a program for each context, as it requires more time, specialized human resources, and more budget. However, the Link and Key technical unit can help and support your operational actor to translate the context analysis into an operational action plan via, for example, programmatic workshop. The second challenge we face is that cross-sectional studies, as for example, Smart Survey or Link and Key, are not the most appropriate tools to look at seasonality, dynamics, or, for example, migration. A possible mitigation could be to promote a joint mixed method, longitudinal and multisectorial system of monitoring evaluation of outcomes. And this will allow us to look at pathway in more detail in the theory of change and on the impact on intervention on those pathways. To respond to persistent GAM, the first step is a multisectorial and integrated approach is to first have a joint comprehensive analysis of the context, but then it requires a joint multisectorial planning aligned on a common nutrition goals and to advocate for coherent and coordinated management of nutrition-specific but also nutrition-sensitive intervention in the 3 dimensions of the major pathway leading to undernutrition. Finally, I would say that an integrated approach will require complementarity and synergy to ensure that interventions are designed not only to complement each other, but also to interact among themselves to maximize their nutritional impact. And for this, it will require to target the same beneficiary population. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. It's very helpful to know that there is actually a demand for this type of analysis and that operational actors are calling for support to do more causal analysis, and also to hear about how the Link NCA approach is evolving. I also found interesting your emphasis on linking the analysis, the understanding, with finding solutions, and in particular, the issue of uptake by stakeholders and local actors. I should also perhaps at this point clarify why in our report and also today, we tend to avoid talking about causes of malnutrition and instead prefer to use the term drivers of malnutrition. And the reason for this is because, as has been pointed out to us many times, we cannot actually prove causality. We can only examine the associations between drivers and acute malnutrition, and using a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods, propose plausible or other plausible explanations as to how different drivers might be linked in a pathway leading to malnutrition. Now, while this is obviously very useful and important, it's not the same as proving causality. Okay, so clearly the complex multi-causal nature of malnutrition is a challenge to unravel, not only for researchers, but also for operational agencies. I'd like to turn to our next panelist, Josephine, who has long experience working with the Humanitarian Nutrition Cluster, and ask, what are the challenges for operational agencies in trying to understand the drivers of persistent GAM? And if they are able to do that, what are the next steps in addressing it? And how do you use these findings, for example, to influence decision makers and the design of programs? Over to you, Josephine.
the issues are currently being. Can you hear me?
Yes. I'd start again, Josephine, if you'd like.
Okay. Yeah. Basically, focus around the challenges for operational agencies in understanding and then also addressing the persistent GAM rates in the field. First of all, I think the key issue for us in the humanitarian setting is really the assessment. How do we assess the need, which then informs our intervention or the package of intervention. And as you can see from the previous presentation, over the last few years, I think when it comes to assessment, which shows us the GAM rates, you know, the Global SMART with support from CDC and a few others, and also ACF, has really managed to streamline assessment methodologies, validation processes, and also making sure that the quality of the anthropometric indicator is really good so that we produce good data, and also mortality. But unfortunately, a number of these surveys are heavily, again, you know, looking at anthropometry, and therefore GAM rates are the ones generated. Good data, but other related data around causality, so that we can then do the kind of analysis that Gwen just talked about, is not possible, one. Two, also, the second issue is in countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan, you know, you don't find small-scale SMART surveys. It's more the demographic health survey, mixed surveys, and so on. And these surveys are not done even annually. In some cases, they are done once every 3 to 5 years. So really, in those countries, the challenge of seasonality and ensuring that we are on top of the trends is a big problem. That's one. So the assessment is one issue. The second one is, again, focusing on the analysis framework, because even if the data is collected so that we can determine what is the immediate, the underlying causes and the basic drivers, we do not have, apart from Link NCA and also the UNICEF conceptual framework, in my view, provides a good framework. But then as nutritionists or as public health practitioners, our ability to really layer this data so that it informs the decision around the response beyond the acute malnutrition rate is a big challenge. I'll give you an example. Recently, we were trying to pull together a toolkit that can help country cluster coordinators and also partners in how to overlay the data so that when GAM rate is X, we know the WHO threshold. How do we then influence the linkages with other sectors so that we can advocate or ensure that the issues, the drivers, are also addressed? This, again, is a big gap, and indeed, in a number of countries, there are partners reaching out to ACF to see whether Link NCA can be used. But the reality on the ground is, given the shortage of funding and the fact that a number of NGOs and also the UN agencies have earmarked money for treatment and not prevention, makes really moving on that difficult. The third issue is around then packaging of the intervention. Even if the analysis is done properly, the key challenge that we are facing is that partly it could be because of, you know, in a number of years, the emergency response have really focused heavily around CMAM or community-based management of acute malnutrition. And what that means is basic other complementary nutrition-specific interventions, such as infant and young child feeding, issues to do with anemia prevention, deworming, and so on, are not systematically part of the package that we deliver as humanitarians. And this really is an issue, especially in the recent emergencies. We are trying to focus on it to see to it that the Lancet series high impact intervention, which are proven, should be applicable to humanitarian situations also. And as Gronya said, GAM high GAM rate is not just an emergency issue. So that is the third point. The fourth one is more on, again, just building onto a good analysis. Even if we have a good analysis, how do we then link or call upon those other sectors in health, in WASH, and in food security to deliver interventions that can support a better nutrition outcome and therefore reduction in acute malnutrition. Again, here the greatest challenge is that over the years as a nutritionist, if your experience has been really more around delivery and treatment, the ability maybe to engage with the other sectors, having the soft skills to advocate, to navigate, and to leverage the support of other sectors for better nutrition outcome is a big challenge. And we are trying to ensure that, for example, the package of intervention and the linkage is there, but this still remains a big issue. The third one is around monitoring of integrated response and reporting on those key drivers. Are they changing? Are they still the same? Again, those are areas, because of the what has been said by the previous presenters, have not really been defined. So even if we go into this integrated response, what are those key issues that we need to report on that can showcase or tell us that we are moving the right direction? The second, the subsequent one is more the issue of sustainability and funding. Most of the emergency response are, short-term funding, and even that then means our ability to influence local systems and provide support, capacity building of local actors still remains short in a number of these emergency situations. So what is the best way to address this is, for example, I'll give you an example of Yemen, where before when the famine situation was, the threat was at its peak, what we all realize is that, over 80% of the treatment is delivered through health systems, but there was lack of payment of staff, Ministry of Health staff. So in that kind of situation, what do? Yes, we are at the peak of an emergency, but there has to be support to ensure that the health systems are strengthened so that we are able to deliver, as well as community level actions. And finally, also, the other bit which we are really falling short on is, there was a mention about the SAN movement, how it approaches and it liberates resources from government, but also other sectors. But as humanitarians, our ability to link with these initiatives so that we can leverage the resources from those initiatives to deliver on on humanitarian action, including the support for treatment of acute malnutrition. And personally, I've had a situation where I've been for a long time part of the global SAN UN network, and it has taken us long to even ensure that preparedness actions are included in the SAN action roadmap, and that humanitarian issues are tabled in this discussion, so that it also becomes the business of the development actors, especially if we all agree that elevated GAM is a problem in all, in many cases, not just in many countries, not just in humanitarian setting. So to end, I would end by saying that with all that has been said, I personally feel if we continue identifying the children early, treating them, and then they go back to the same environment, and with that all, we expect that will reduce global acute malnutrition rate without really focusing on some of the structural issues, the issues that affects all the drivers. Well, we are going to be in this for a long time. And this has been the case in a number of countries, South Sudan, name it. this is how the rate has persisted, because those drivers have never been addressed. We haven't addressed the structural issues. With that, I would end there.
Thanks very much, Josephine. Clearly, there are some strong common themes coming through with the earlier speakers, especially the linking with development, especially in more stable contexts. But I'm also struck that it sounds like there are no simple shortcuts that we can apply to help us answer the question of what is driving persistent GAM. And if we don't have those answers, if we don't have that analysis, it sounds like we have to depend on a more general situation analysis to inform programming, so a blunter instrument, and perhaps a more off-the-shelf package approach to emergency nutrition interventions, more protracted emergency nutrition interventions, and one that potentially focuses more on treatment rather than prevention. Thank you also for raising some of the structural limitations as to how we might apply an understanding of drivers, in particular the short-term funding cycles, and the need for support for nutrition-sensitive approaches from other sectors, which might be limited or challenging. Sectors have become, or in some contexts, are siloed, and also potentially because of capacity issues. Okay, so now I think we have a much better idea of some of the challenges facing us. I would like to hear more about what can actually be done to address this. And so let me turn to our fourth panelist, Abigail, to ask, in your experience, Abigail, what is being done to address this problem, and what else do you think can be done looking ahead to the future to address the problem of persistent GAM? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. So I think the first thing to say in terms of what's being done is that events like this are increasing. We are hearing people talking about acute malnutrition, agencies, actors who have not typically talked about this problem previously. So I think the current climate is an incredibly positive one. There's a real opportunity to progress this issue. So I'd like to feel quite positive about that as a starting point. So in terms of what more needs to be done, we've tried to loosely group this into policy areas, program areas, and research. All three are really critical for progressing this agenda, and I pick up particularly on points that have been raised by previous speakers. So when thinking about the policy environment, it's absolutely critical that we are able to make the most of the broader interest that there is in nutrition. Aside from people talking a lot about wasting at the moment, the last decade has been an incredibly important time for raising nutrition up the agenda. So through the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, the World Bank's focus on human capital and building human capital, and through the Nutrition for Growth events that have happened as well. So thinking through how we can really use those moments to raise the profile of wasting alongside stunting and other forms of malnutrition is really critical. And I think particularly looking to the Japanese government's nutrition summit that they're planning to host in 2020 is a point at which we can really galvanize energy and interest in this area. And to do that, we really need to get as clear as we can about what wasting means. And that is both in terms of child survival, but also in terms of what's happening around future human capital. It's a slightly strange phrase to talk about, but thinking through how does wasting play out in terms of the longer-term development and opportunities that children who've been affected will get. This is a really critical argument for really making the case to say we need to address this problem. But when it comes back to the point on child survival, I think we also need to be much, much stronger about talking about the role of wasting as driving poor health outcomes as well and driving child mortality. It's really critical to get our health colleagues much more on board and thinking about how does the issue of wasting and indeed, to be honest, stunting become much more part of a conversation about the role of health system strengthening, and within the whole wider discussion on universal health coverage. At the policy level, it's also really critical that we actually start measuring what we're doing. It's really problematic still that we see large investments in nutrition country level, regional level, that don't actually even consider wasting as a measure of success and look at whether or not we're delivering targets. It's relatively straightforward to add it in. At least if we're tracking it, we have a sense of whether or not we're getting there. And that has to be a really critical ask for governments, for development donors, for anybody who's actually supporting efforts around nutrition. At the program level, and this also picks up on points that have been raised earlier, it's really important that we encourage all actors working this to take a much more joined up and a much more coordinated approach to address these key drivers. I think there's often a tendency within that to fear that it could become so complex. I tend to stay away from the word integration because sometimes it makes people feel a little uncomfortable. But at least imagining how we can line up investments that can really tackle those key drivers and really start to work in harmony to reduce this very tricky problem. And I think we're increasingly seeing that this is going to need for us to really reframe how we think about and look at this concept of nutrition vulnerability, and that encompasses wasting and stunting and other forms as well. So thinking much more broadly in our multi-sector planning, informed by really strong analysis, and making sure that wasting is considered equally alongside stunting and other forms of malnutrition. And this is a message that's coming out through a paper that we've been working on with the Emergency Nutrition Network, ENN, looking at the etiology of wasting and thinking, where do we go from here? And linked to this is also going to be a need for really strong, effective partnerships, localization and participatory ways of working. People on the ground feel this problem, they know this problem, it's got to be part of the solution. So then turning over to the issue of research, and this is an area where there is a greater need for action. So there is specific additional work needed to further unpack the incidence of wasting. It's a surprisingly complicated issue to understand, as well as the relationship between wasting, stunting and mortality. The very brilliant work that's been done so far by the ENN-led Wasting Stunting Group has really laid a foundation for reframing and rethinking this problem, but we need to build on that work. We also need to think a lot more about some of the areas of potential drivers of this problem that are a little bit more complicated to understand and think through. So environmental enteropathy, what's happening around the gut microbiome, there's some very fascinating issues linked to that, but also thinking about the role of pre-existing nutritional status. So what role does maternal nutritional status going into pregnancy, what happens during pregnancy, what's happening around early infancy, the relationship that stunting then plays in terms of increasing risk of wasting and persistent GAM. We also still need further innovation and research around the affordability, quality and coverage of treatment services. I think within this whole conversation of persistent GAM, there will be a tendency to talk prevention, and that's really critical. But I think as Gronya mentioned earlier, it has to be that spectrum of prevention through to treatment. That's going to be the most effective way for us to manage this problem. But we need to make that service more affordable, we need to get it out to more people. And I think more broadly with this, when it comes to the research agenda, we do need to take a pragmatic approach. Resources are quite limited around nutrition research still. So it is also really critical to think through how can we measure properly what happens when we do coordinate our efforts to address the range of drivers of wasting that we know exist. So how can really good operational research play a role in building our understanding? Now, the No Wasted Lives Coalition that Gronya mentioned earlier on, which is this great initiative to really give energy and focus to this challenge of wasting, has already set out research priorities around treatment of severe acute malnutrition. And the Emergency Nutrition Network, through support from MQSUN Plus, is now undertaking a research prioritization process on prevention of wasting. And so hopefully these two research frameworks, alongside the priorities that have been set out on the management of acute malnutrition in infants, which is a really key and neglected area, so the 0 to 6 month group, hopefully offer an opportunity to really prioritize research investment so that we don't spend the next 15 years trying to answer questions. We, in 5 years' time, can come back together and have a much clearer sense of how we address this really persistent challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby. This sounds very exciting, and it's very encouraging to hear about the more joined up thinking and the emphasis on linking up with more development nutrition initiatives and the need to take a more coordinated approach. And listening to you, I think what's particularly striking is that you are advocating for change and for looking at things afresh, including reframing nutritional vulnerability, promoting further research and innovation. From an academic point of view, this very much sounds like an important learning agenda, which might call for increasing collaboration and also potentially partnerships, including operational actors and research institutions. Anyway, so with that, this concludes the prepared topics that we had for discussion. And with the remaining time, and we have about half an hour, I'd like to open things up more generally to the audience. Now, we've received some questions, but I would also urge you to send us more. And you can direct them generally to the entire panel or to any one of us. And we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So let us start with some of the questions that have already come through. And I'm not sure I'll be able to keep these to a logical order, so we might touch on different topics. We might move about a little bit in our discussion. Anyway, the first discussion is actually regarding the nutrition causal framework. And it's directed to me as a researcher. How useful do you find the nutrition causal framework to inform of the causes of malnutrition? Well, I have to say that, you know, since the 90s, I've always been a huge fan of the nutrition causal conceptual framework. And that's particularly because of the way it captured the complexity of malnutrition causality, but at the same time was a very practical, simple tool when applied at the local level for developing, helping to develop a local understanding of what drivers were in a particular context, even in the context of sharing, having discussions with local communities and local actors. I'm also, when we were doing this work, I mean, one of the things that we were really quite amazed by is that it's quite remarkable that the original nutrition causal conceptual framework proposed by UNICEF in the 90s has survived relatively intact for nearly 3 decades. But however, that said, in the course of doing this work, I did come round to the view that it is time for a review, particularly given our understanding now of there are an increasing number of cross-cutting issues in relation to vulnerability, and the issues that came up particularly strongly in our synthesis paper related to gender, which is not limited to care, obviously, and is cross-cutting across all the underlying and basic causes, and also livelihoods that drive so much of the local decision-making. And also another issue that's been mentioned today already, and that is seasonality, which we know in many contexts, especially across the Sahel, exert a huge influence on the prevalence rates of GAM and on some of the main drivers. So I'll perhaps leave it there and just ask if anybody else on the panel would like to, you know, add a comment on the utility of the nutrition conceptual framework of UNICEF. And if you would like to speak, just to remind you to make sure you're not on mute. Okay, fine.
Hi, Ellen, sorry, I was on mute.
Oh, that's okay. Welcome, Josephine.
Yes, yeah. No, I personally feel the conceptual framework, if it's really unpacked properly at the various levels and also its interaction at various levels, I do think it's still relevant. it's, for me, the real challenge is we have all used the conceptual framework for trainings to explain causality, well, drivers now we refer to, but I think, and it's issues like conflict, livelihood, gender, and seasonality can still fit there. They're there at the various level. But I think for me the challenge is, how do you do that analysis? How do you overlay the data so that it makes sense, you know, for programming, for decision making, and so on. So I really feel that is the biggest challenge rather than the framework itself.
Thank you, Josephine. That's very helpful. Any other comments? Just add, before we move off this really important topic, that it might be worth actually looking at how it's been applied. And I think in a lot of the material we were reviewing, it seemed that the focus is very much on the individual and the household level, rather than looking at the more community and higher levels that are captured in the framework. And as a result, that tends to be linked with very technical solutions. So the treatment of acute malnutrition, or digging a borehole, or providing so much water per person per day. So maybe we also need to think about broadening the analysis to those wider levels. But I think, Josephine, you have a point about how you actually do that analysis, and that's where I think the work of ACS and others is going to be really important. So if we perhaps move on and look at some of the questions that have come in. Let me just find them. 1 minute. I actually have some comments and questions. And actually, this is a general question for the panel. One of our participants asks, or explains, that many countries are now coming up with multi-sectoral programs and plans at scale to address undernutrition. And the primary focus of these, as we've heard, is stunting. But in addition, we're suggesting there is a need for multi-sectoral interventions to address persistent GAM. The question is, do we think programming for stunting and wasting should be brought together in some countries and in some regions where there are pockets of stunting, wasting, and both concurrently? And also, how is this to be handled by a government which is looking for a uniform approach at scale? So a long question, but I think touching on a lot of the issues that came up in your presentations. Who would like to start?
Helen, I'd like to attempt that to start with, if okay. Can you
hear
me?
Yes.
Right. I think that's a great question, and I actually really agree with it. I think we have created this artificial divide between stunting and wasting, and yes, we don't fully understand the relationship between the two, and we don't understand fully why some children become wasted and others become stunted, and it's definitely complex. But what we do know is that a lot of the strategies to prevent it are similar, and that's what it comes to. So I think when we are designing programs, we should be measuring both acute malnutrition and chronic and stunting as outcomes, as measures of success, going back to what Abby said earlier. And when we're designing, we need to keep an eye on both indicators and see how do they move across time, across population age groups, across season, so that then we can tweak our programs as we move along to see actually whether or not they're having an impact on the two outcomes. So I really agree that that's a very welcome solution, and it ultimately it's about bringing the development and humanitarian sector more closely, and then, you know, at both ends, yes, there are differences, but at least the major parts of the prevention strategies are very similar, and that's important also for communication to governments in terms of prioritizing in general around malnutrition and not just prioritizing one over the other. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Grania. Would anybody else like to comment?
Yeah, I really fully agree with that comment, and I also think based on the fact that, it's not just a humanitarian or emergency problem, then, and also these development programs, or whether it's the Scaling Up Nutrition Initiative, it should be focusing on addressing undernutrition in general. Yeah, and it's only then that we can really bridge this gap. Secondly, also, that will allow us to stop branding acute malnutrition only with humanitarian situation, because that's not the case.
Thank you, Josephine. And actually, Josephine, while we have you, there is a very specific question for you. I think you already answered it, but it might be helpful just to make sure. And that question is, the SUN movement is focused on stunting reduction through multifactorial interventions. Would you recommend that SUN expand its focus to look at persistent GAM, which, as we've highlighted, is also a problem of stable context?
Yeah, the answer is yes, because, I mean, at the end of the day, I think what we are trying to do is ensure that government is on the driver's seat and provide the structure, the support to deliver in various aspects of undernutrition. And in that respect, I really think, SUN is a better place to do that, in also ensuring that acute malnutrition is addressed. And in fact, just to also mention that in the last global gathering of SUN, the coordination and in linkage between SUN and the humanitarian aspect of what we do was discussed, and there were suggestions around how that linkage can be created. So this really presents a perfect opportunity to also have on both eyes, so that we have better understanding and deliver for a better nutrition outcome.
Thank you, Josephine. Does anybody else want to add their thoughts on including wasting under SUN?
Hi, Helen, it's Abby. Go ahead. I mean, I think one thing to note is that one of the requirements or one of the expectations that there is under SUN, so countries that are in the SUN movement that are developing multi-sector plans, is that they're actually talking about targets, how they're going to reach the range of targets that exist. Those at the moment are clearer as approved through the World Health Assembly, but obviously looking forward to the SDG targets. And that does include wasting as well. So the framing is there. The opportunity, the kind of accountability exists on this particular challenge of wasting, and we shouldn't forget that. There is a target in the SDGs and in the World Health Assembly agreement around wasting. And so we need to utilize that much more. But I think to transform that into something where we're talking about policies and programs that are thinking about nutrition vulnerability, stunting, wasting, and other forms of malnutrition, does then require this, really real consideration of how the different actors that work in support of government, who help government to frame and understand how those priorities can play through, what it means programmatically, are also speaking together about this issue. So I don't see it as kind of either it's in SUN or not SUN. That's not the way I envisage this. But I do think it's about the need to join up our voices much more. Programmatically, I think it's quite an interesting challenge. I totally agree with Grania and Josephine's points about, particularly Grania's points around the drivers, the origins of these issues being very similar, and therefore the programmatic responses being very similar. And I think it seems logical and efficient and hopefully ultimately effective to really think about this as combined programming. I think it's worth noting that sometimes we have the assumption that we've got everything sorted on stunting prevention. And it may feel like that, but the Lancet package of interventions is modelled only on reducing stunting by 20%. So there is quite a lot more understanding that's needed in terms of how we're preventing nutrition vulnerability in the whole. And so by, as Grania mentioned, by actually measuring this, by tracking what's happening, by thinking about the problem holistically rather than in silos, we stand a chance of being able to line a better set of investments up to address those drivers. And that needs to go all the way back into what's happening among adolescent girls, women, before and during pregnancy, into early infancy, and into childhood. And I think really, if you're looking at that way of programming, I'm pretty convinced if we can line this stuff up better, speak to each other more effectively, then there is that chance of reducing GAM, but also having that impact on stunting as well. Yes, the numbers of stunted kids are coming down, but it's still not quick enough. So we can't, it can't be either one or the other. We've got to conceive this as two things, where we've still got a lot of learning and a lot of work to do to pull that together.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for that clarification. Obviously, this is an important discussion, and a number of you are kind of coming back to it. But I do want to flag the risk of potentially missing those specific contexts where persistent GAM has been reported. And what I mean by that is that many of the contexts where people were identifying as affected by persistent GAM were not entire countries, but they were specific regions or areas or even groups in a particular country, which potentially represent more peripheral or marginalized areas, hence the reason why they might be experiencing protracted humanitarian crises. So I just want to kind of flag that potential risk of, while focusing on the opportunities of linking up, linking humanitarian and development, is there also potentially a risk of ignoring those specific protracted crises who would not necessarily be a priority in their context. Maybe though, before I should also move on, and we have a point coming in from one of our listeners who says, a similar point is referral to prevention of acute malnutrition versus prevention of stunting. The listener has heard these phrases often used, and I think we've heard it today. Do the panelists feel there's really a significant difference in prevention strategies for acute malnutrition versus stunting, or can we just talk about prevention of undernutrition in all its forms? So who would like to take that? I think, Grania, you partly answered it, to be honest.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. That's a big question. A lot of the drivers are the same, in terms of good infant feeding practices, in terms of breastfeeding, in terms of protecting nutritional status, good health-seeking behaviors, treatment of stunted illness.
Grania, can you speak up a little?
Oh, yes. Can you hear me now?
That's better.
Hello? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I was just saying that a lot of the drivers are similar. It's the good infant feeding practices, exclusive breastfeeding, good complementary feeding, health-seeking behavior, etc., in terms of protecting against malnutrition. But what we do know, and maybe going back to what you just said, Helen, which brought something to mind, there are certain populations that have different levels of risk factors to acute malnutrition because they have higher levels of vulnerability in general. And so hospitals have the cushion that maybe other parts of the country might carry them through, for example, hunger seasons. So what we do see in many countries is that in the areas where you have very high rating, in general, you'll also find generally poor indications of exposure around immunization, around access to safe water, etc. So I think while a lot of the strategies that are seen, we need to look at those particular areas where we see these large seasonal spikes to understand what more do they need. And likely they will need more of a safety net or a protection mechanism levels of vulnerability are higher. So it's not exactly the same in terms of prevention strategies, and it's really about understanding your context and understanding the vulnerabilities driving those particular populations where we see these very high spikes at different times of the year and due to different seasonal effects like drought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grania. Another question has just come in, which is changing the subject a little bit. And I think it would be helpful to have some clarifications. Our participant comments, there is an argument that the determinants of malnutrition are far more complex than mere food. Has this been proven to be the case in the four countries in the presentation? So I assume you mean in relation to our 4 case studies, and in fact this was a topic for review as part of our report, and we chart the shifting views in perspectives on what are the drivers of malnutrition. And what's notable in the protracted context is that frequently it's been confirmed that food indeed is not the driver of malnutrition, which raises a lot of questions about what exactly is driving it. Would any of our panel like to comment on this particular issue? Or Anna, would you like to come in?
Helen, it's Abby. I'm happy to comment, or let Anna.
Let's have both of you. Would you like to start, Abby, and then Anna, if she'd like to?
That sounds great. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks. We've been funding some research looking at food assistance approaches and how those are effective or not at preventing acute malnutrition through the Rafani research. And that's really highlighted very nicely in the 3 contexts where the research was done, so Niger, Somalia, and Pakistan, that improving access to food, improving diet diversity is achievable using cash transfers, but you don't automatically see that prevention of wasting. And what the data from those contexts, and particularly from Niger and Somalia, indicate is that disease outbreaks, so outbreaks of malaria, which is not dealt with effectively, in the case of Somalia, issues around very low vaccination coverage rates leading to spikes in certain key infectious diseases. It seems to be very strongly associated then with those increases in acute malnutrition. And I'm sure that Grania can speak with much more credibility about the relationship between disease outbreaks and malnutrition spikes in the context of a setting like Somalia. I think the other area that is where there's increasing evidence and something that we really need to think about very, very carefully is what's happening during pregnancy and this relationship between low birth weight and subsequent risk of wasting, but equally around some of the really particular challenges on mental health and mental well-being and the relationship that has with increased risk of wasting. So yes, it's one of the areas where we probably love it to be much more straightforward, but I think there's a kind of an increasing clear evidence that it is much more complex, and hence pointing to the really important need for work like the LinkNCA to really look at these drivers and to think through, if we're not addressing one driver, is that the reason why we then don't see the impact that we want to have on reducing wasting?
Thanks, Abby. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Abby. So I think the role of food in malnutrition is definitely very context specific, but some of the work that we've done here at the Feinstein Center, looking at the peaks of malnutrition and what time of the year they occur, show that there is a discrepancy between the peaks of food insecurity and malnutrition. For example, in South Sudan, we've shown that there are 2 peaks before the rainy season and after the rainy season in malnutrition, while food security primarily peaks obviously after the rainy season. We're seeing something similar similar in Sudan, and certainly in the context where we're working in Chad. Then there's also in regards to Bangladesh and in Chad, some of the data shows the lack of relationship from a just statistical analysis point of view between food security and malnutrition. And our work in Chad further highlights the role of water, water and the presence of livestock as really being some of the main drivers. But this is again in Chad. It is very much context specific, but the role of water and contamination from cattle in that water that seems to be the most strongly associated with malnutrition and the timing of peaks of malnutrition. So I think it's very important to look at all of the causes, look at them as integrated and together, but also be able to understand that different contexts have different types of pathogens and hence different associations between water and some of those other drivers, including food security and malnutrition. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And I would also really direct you to the report because there's a lot of detail speaking to this particular question. Okay, next I'd like to turn to Gwen. We have a comment and a question. The comment is, I really agree to a certain point on efforts by ACF on LINK-NCA on drivers and pathways to malnutrition. As NCA evolves, how practical is it in emergency areas, especially where disasters, conflicts are key factors driving high and persistent acute malnutrition? Also on the Link-NCA methodology, is it possible to contextualize the method itself, inclusive of tools and process? So a question about the practicality of NCA and the possibility of contextualizing it. Yeah, exactly. So over to you, Gwen, if that's...
Thank you, Helen. About the practical question, we have done several Link-NCA in emergency context, but it needs to be adaptation. It should have some adaptation depending on the security context, depending on what kind of data we can access, either qualitative data or quantitative. So we can maybe play a little bit on the duration and who should gather the data and the best profile of the analyst and the surveyor. And we just finished Link-NCA in 7 camps in Chad with UNHCR, but also we're going to start an adaptation of the Link-NCA with ICRC in CAR, where the security context is always evolving. So we will adapt the methodology, the data collection part.
Okay, thank you, Gwen. Okay, so I have another question here that's actually for Anna, but anyone else can jump in. It was mentioned earlier by Abby, I think, about the importance of considering environmental enteropathy and how it's an understudied driver of malnutrition. The question is, what do you think are the implications of the most recent SHINE trial in Zimbabwe and the WASH benefits trial in Bangladesh on the role of WASH in preventing malnutrition and environmental enteropathy? Over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Helen. So while the findings from the 2 studies are certainly disappointing in regards to the relationship between WASH and child malnutrition, I don't believe that it actually rules out the role of water-related contamination as a contributor to malnutrition. And mainly there are 2 reasons for this. So one has to do with the design of a study itself in regards to its focus on household interventions rather than community interventions. And when you're talking about the contamination of water, it really does matter what your neighbors do as much as what you're doing. And then the other part has to do with the specificity of the interventions themselves. So the study tested the efficacy of a very standard package of WASH intervention. It is very robust, obviously, and the intervention itself is quite complete, but it was the this intervention was put in place without first identifying what the pathways and the interactions between those pathways might be. And when we're talking about water contamination, there are really multiple pathways and multiple different contaminants. And the type of pathogens also very much differ by context and even within the country, depending on the climate and other factors. So in many cases, you really do have to first identify, I think, what those pathogens are. And one example of that is in the intervention, chlorine was used as the main disinfectant for water, but there are certain species of pathogens that actually aren't affected by it. And one of those species is Cryptosporidium parvum, which has been associated with high levels of diarrhea, mortality, and EE. So I think that while these trials are extremely important, there does need to be there needs to be more research that's looking into context and livelihood specific exploration of what the drivers of malnutrition might be. Thank you, Helen. Back to you.
Just wait one moment while I line them up. The first one is...
Helen, can you just repeat yourself? Sorry, I think you were on mute when you started.
Okay, sorry about that. We have a couple of questions come in that are both relating to the situation in India. And so I think we might put out there two questions for our panelists to think about. The first one is, in some states of India, we have witnessed a remarkable decrease in child. The prevalence of wasting has persistently been higher than 15%. How should this inform our actions programs? And then we have another question, which is, hold on 1 minute while I find it. It's concerning a comparison between the issue of persistent GAM in Africa compared with, say, Asia. And I think that's particularly directed to the researchers, to us. But anyway, I'll add that too, because I think with your experience, panel, you might be able to comment. So who would like to have a go at answering these two quite tough questions?
I can think of a question.
Could you speak up, please, Grania? We're having difficulty hearing.
Okay, how's this?
That's great.
Yeah, so I very interesting observation about the reduction in child mortality and yet remaining high wasting. I mean, I think this is everywhere. I think globally, child and infant mortality has massively reduced since the Millennium Development Goals. But it's true, we can't say the same for other nutrition outcome indicators. And I think, yes, it's important to look at vaccination, but I guess it goes back to questions around child feeding, diversity of diet, you know, what birth weight the child is when they're born, how it was the maternal nutritional status. So I think, again, it's just highlighting that unfortunately we don't have a silver bullet. We don't have one intervention that works. So while they all have a role to play, unless we can line them all up and make sure that the key interventions that we know have some impact are implemented, only then will we begin to see the overall nutrition outcome indicators reduce. And I think, you know, nutrition in a way is almost a composite index of so many things, of behaviors, of health status, of dietary intake. So it's, while we can move one way with certain indicators, we still need to keep looking at the other key indicators, especially around child feeding. Over.
Helen, I think you're on mute.
You're on mute.
Excuse me, I forgot to turn my mute button off. Thank you very much, Grania. I just wanted to add a brief comment to agreeing with Grania on the fact that this seems quite common, but also that we often see that malnutrition and mortality indicators do not move in tandem, which sometimes people assume that they automatically do, but there are many different factors influencing both. And I think there are papers out there that describe this. On the other issue, comparing Asia and Africa, Anna, do you want to make a comment on the 4 case studies, and then we might also comment on the fact that that most of the countries that were mentioned by our respondents were in the Sahel and Horn of Africa, and most respondents mentioned the same countries, so there was a lot of agreement between them.
Helen, sorry, can you repeat the question for me again?
Sure. The question was, I'll just try and find it exactly as it's phrased. Any differences that came up in your analysis between Africa and Asia? So there's the general review of the 25 countries, and then there's the specific 4 case studies, of which one was in Asia.
Yeah, so some of the differences that we saw in terms of the drivers have to do with the nutritional status of the mother, but also in terms of sanitation. So one of the things that we see in places like India and Bangladesh and Pakistan is really high urban density, also combined with open defecation, and that seems to be one of the main drivers, as well as the weight of a mother at birth. Some work has showed that on average, a woman in India, the weight that she has at 9 months of pregnancy is equivalent to the weight of a woman at 1 month of pregnancy in the Sahel. So clearly the drivers are very different and certainly very context specific. But in places like in the Sahel, for example, where we're seeing in some contexts certainly a low role of open defecation, possibly because of the arid environment, and instead we're seeing, at least as we're exploring in our own research, kind of a role of the defecation due to animals and the contamination of the water. So I think it's really important to keep in mind these differences and understand that they're not just between continents, but you can also find them within the same district, specifically different drivers. And so it's important to explore them to tailor any intervention accordingly. Thanks, Helen.
Thank you, Anna. And I would also just add that in the Sahel and Horn of Africa, we're seeing extreme seasonality in the drivers and the prevalence rates as well. But I realize we're approaching the end of our webinar, and I would like to take this opportunity to offer the panelists the chance to share any short final thoughts. So who would like to start?
Hi, Helen. It's Abby. I'll go ahead. I guess my final kind of takeaway on this is recently stunting was identified as what's being referred to as a bellwether indicator. So an indicator that is tracking whether or not development is inclusive, it's reaching everybody, are we leaving no one behind? And I think it would be great to put wasting up there as a bellwether indicator. It's such an incredible measure of whether or not we're doing what we need to do. And so the advocates are on the line. It would be great to see if we can line up that so that more governments, more donors, other operational agencies really understand the importance that this particular issue plays.
Thank you, Abby. And next, shall we go to Grania?
Thanks, Helen.
A little louder.
This is still a relatively new research area, and if you look from 2000, we only had 1 country implementing programs for treatment of acute malnutrition. Now we have 75, so we've done a lot in 18 years. If we can keep the same level of momentum and take these programs to scale, and also look much more at prevention, I think it's a great opportunity, and I'm quite excited to see a lot of the questions are not universities, and a lot of the participants are from different regions in the world that participate
over. Thank you, Grania. And Josephine or Gwenelle? Josephine, would you like to give us a final thought?
Yeah, no, mine is basically to say that I really think the timing of this research couldn't have been better, because what we have been seeing in a number of these countries, the persistency and so on, really should compel us to looking at how we should really approach acute malnutrition differently. And therefore, you know, the comment from the panelists around ensuring that we still maintain prevention actions, while also realizing that I think we should look at acutely malnourished child, especially those who are at the risk of dying, as individuals who need help and they need to be treated. And then that should also be accompanied with the structural input to ensure that the systems are in place to provide the treatment and the linkage with other sectors. So basically mine is to say thank you so much to all the participants and for their inciting comments. I would also like to say that the differences which were highlighted in the various regions is a clear indication that we really have to dig deeper in the context, which can then help us to identify the drivers effectively and address them. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine. And Gwen, would you like to make a final remark before we close?
Yes, I would like to thank you. We are within ACS, we are very interested into this issue around persistent GAM, and we are also very much interested into working on new tool and methodology to improve our understanding of this persistent GAM issues and also how to address it.
Thank you, Gwen. We are about out of time, in fact, a minute or so over, so I need to wrap up quickly. My final thought was simply how delighted I am to hear panelists confirming the need for more collaborative, interdisciplinary approaches and more attention to these issues. That includes research uptake and how we use the information analysis we've got. And I would include by national and local actors. So thank you, Gwen, Josephine, Grania, and Abby, and also to Anastasia for sharing your experience. And thanks to all of you for joining us and for sending in your questions and experiences. If there are questions that we did not get to, please send them over to me or the relevant panelists, and all email addresses are on the slide. And as follow-up, we will share the webinar recording with you in the next couple of days. And I would also say, when you leave the webinar, a very short survey will pop up. Please do us a favor and take 2 minutes to fill it out. We think this is a great format, but your feedback will help us improve it. So this includes our webinar for today. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.